Hello, my name is Dr. Scott Young, and today we're going to talk to you about NESARA, the Federal Reserve, and corruption. Coming right up. Okay, so you've probably seen a little bit of my stuff. Now, we have a whole money list that you can look at. You can look at the gold-backed standard in NESARA and the Bible, because I love doing that part. We have a whole interview series, if you've watched all 4 of them, with Matt Moore, a money specialist, that talks a lot about this, but I want to get into a little more detail about the Federal Reserve. Now, here's the thing that happens with most people when they consider the Federal Reserve. They never heard of it. They go, what is that? Sounds like a federal agency. People are trained, most people are trained to say, you know, money is just boring. I don't study it. I'll let my financial planner do that, or I let a banker do that. Doesn't the bank know about that? I remember when we were changing to a new bank, I had a bank vice president came in and she wanted to talk to me a lot about this. And she and I have talked quite a bit. And the other person around her was struggling. He goes, yeah, doesn't the Federal Reserve do the money part? He didn't know enough about that. Now, the reality, what's coming, we're in August of 2020. What's coming is NESARA, and I'll explain that in a little bit here in a minute. But when that comes, you need to change your thought process related to money. So let's get into the short background of the Federal Reserve. So 1912, April of 1912, is a fascinating time frame. I've been a Christian for 42 years, but I remember studying really deeply on things. Because I had dyslexia, it was hard for me to learn information. I worked really hard and I started to read when I was 16. I really didn't read much before that. I mean, a little, but not much. But I was getting into end time issues, but I was also studying about any other kind of topic. My mom can read a James Michener. Now you go, what? A James Michener is when he would write these books, they're 1,000-page novels. Now that, as an author and a writer myself, I just think, what? I mean, I'm gonna show you this. One of my longer books here is just, this one's 200 pages. I have another couple of them in there that are 250 pages right up here on Foretold Ministry. I mean, so it was a 2-book series, 500 pages of writing. Man, it took me forever. I mean, it was so much extra work that I couldn't, explain it. And yet, my mom could take a Michener and read it in a month. So she kind of taught me to read and get into this kind of stuff and get into history. So let's do a little history lesson. The Titanic was built by J.P. Morgan and funded by J.P. Morgan. He didn't just, commission it to be built. He paid for it as well. Days before the Titanic leaves from England, he pulls himself off the boat. Fascinating. Who's on that boat? Isa Strauss, John Jacob Astor IV, and Benjamin Guggenheim. These are multimillionaires. In today's terminology, we would call them billionaires. Now, all 3 of them die on the Titanic, and you go, that's kind of weird, isn't it? And we have heroic stories in the movie Titanic, by James Cameron, I think it is, and heroic stories about these guys, but we don't really know what will happen. But that is an amazing part, because most of the time, billionaires will find their way off a boat, okay? If they want to figure it out, they're really cunning in that abilities. But what's more interesting is they were against the Federal Reserve. Now, we'll talk about that in a second. All 3 of them were against the Federal Reserve. Now, this is a central bank. And what you need to know, a little historical part, is that we, as Americans in 1775, threw over the tea in the Boston Tea Party because we had taxation without representation. We hated that idea. And by the way, all of us hate that idea too. And we hated the Stamp Act and all these other ways that the crown was trying to tell the colonies what they could and couldn't do and what they were going to take from them. So Thomas Jefferson was very against the Federal Reserves. And the fascinating thing is Rockefeller used to say, I don't care who makes the laws as long as I can make the money. That's the part that's fascinating. So there's always ebbs and flows of the central banks trying to dictate the money to the people. Now, it started to come up with a bank run in 1907. So 1912, they had this possibility. They had the Federal Reserve in essence. And you can read this on The Creature of Jekyll Island. It's a very powerful book that will give you some background on the Federal Reserve. And there's several others, including The Killing of Uncle Sam by Rodney Howard Brown. Oh my gosh, this is really good. If you listen to it as an audiobook, it's even better. The guy can do all the accents. I love that when someone does an accent so perfectly. I couldn't possibly do that. Now, 1912, you have three guys that are against the Federal Reserve and they die in a boat. 1913, we have three of the candidates. So we have Taft, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, that all three of the banks, the central banks, decided to back all three of them so that whoever won, they won. So they came up with the Federal Reserve, and Woodrow Wilson, in December 23rd, 1913, signs the Federal Reserve into law. That the Congress could, at least sort of oversee, but that was a fakeness. That they were overseeing putting it into law. He would sign it into law. The president could appoint the chairman of the Federal Reserve, but the governors were underneath the chairman, but they had no control or no backlash to the Congress or the presidency. I mean, wait a second. You got to know who's inside of the Federal Reserve. Do you know who is in the Federal Reserve? All the banks. The JP Morgan, the Bank of England, the Rockefellers, all of these big boys that control a great big amount of money. The things that people who are into democratic socialism and socialism in America and communism and capitalism and all of these other isms hate, and they should hate, the 1%, the cabal. This is what they're doing. And they set this up. They set up this process to defraud and take away the money sources. And you have to ask the question, how do they do this? So the Federal Reserve creates the money. They started to bring in, through the IRS, the 14th Amendment, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But the IRS was allowed to create a taxation upon your wealth. You're about wealth. That's it. I mean, what you can bring into them. So I get taxed. It goes to the IRS, who takes their cut because, they're working their little thing, right? And then it goes directly over to the Treasury Department, who takes their cut a little bit of that because they're working their thing, and then shunts the money over to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve gets to take off a 6% of all the monies every single year, and then they make the cash and reflow it back into the economy. Now, when you hear it on the other end without this part of this, you kind of see, wow, the Federal Reserve just helps the money, and they help regulate things. They help the flow and devalue and revalue and boost the values, and we have to have that. We have to have the stability that comes with the Federal Reserve, and they want to tell you that stuff. And the reality is, there's more corruption than I can possibly explain to you. I mean, I could spend hours to do this, but we're going to talk about this in a shorter time frame than that. Okay. But what's even more crazy is that not after 1913, in 1914, as a history buff myself, 1914, we have the World War I starts. No, it's the most fake beginning of a war with Ferdinand, blanking out the name here, Archduke Ferdinand and his wife get killed in Sarajevo. And you go, why would that like draw in the whole world? I mean, it had Australia, and we had Turkey and Russia and Germany and England and France, and then later on America. And I mean, we had all these countries coming in, and African nations, tasked by the British to come in. And, this was the Great War. This is also called the War to End All Wars. What a fallacy that was. And what the Federal Reserve was doing is they were shunting cash to both sides, and they were making money inside of the creation of weapons. And these weapons were so gross, like mustard gas, that people would die and disfigure and couldn't see anymore. All this gross stuff that happened. It was a disgusting war. Some people will tell you it's about 10 million people. It's really more like 30 million people that die. And the 1920s in America had this massive amount of growth because we had credit coming in to America. But see, it's not good enough to have a devaluation, which is a good thing, from their standpoint. A devaluation of money allows that money to flow, but you got to flip it on its side and do an inflation issue, which devalues the money. I know it sounds crazy when you think of inflation devalues. Deflation increases the value of that money. But here's what happened. In February of 1929, the Federal Reserve meets, and they just meet, and we don't even hear exactly what the meeting is about, but you catch the meeting as you backtrack it through. No notes are taken because they never take notes on this stuff. But here's what occurred. What they did is they took away the money chain. So what they, in essence, they did with the stock market is that you had to have a margin call. Let me give you an example. You, in 1929, that a house is worth, $10,000 at best, okay? So if you have a stock that's worth $5, let's say, and it rises, we'll just say for the heck of it, $10, and you have 1,000 shares, you put up only that amount of money, that $500, so you have, or $1,000, but it's really worth $10,000. You've got 1,000, only 10% up to a $10,000 amount. It increases in value in 1920 that you get that, and increases in value until 1929, it's up to 25 bucks a share, let's just say. Then in October of 29, the great stock market crash. The bankers come to you and say, you have to pay that last part of it. You got to come up with the $9,000 for that initial amount. You can keep it. And you go, wait a minute, I don't have $9,000. That's more money than I can possibly come up with. And yet that's exactly what they did. So my stock was worth 25 bucks, but not anymore because everyone's trying to sell. And when they're selling, the value goes down and down and down and down. And then it comes to, penny stocks. This is when we had the idea of that penny stock, and it could be worth 25 cents. And then guess what? One of those central bankers buys it at 25 cents. And I might have a few $100 of the $1,000. So I've lost this massive amount of value. And then maybe I try to run to the bank just to get my cash out, and I can't get the cash out. So what happened is this great transfer of wealth from the people, from these Federal Reserve people and the central bankers, this cabal that now have the assets, and took it from the American people. And we move into the Great Depression. In 1933, FDR, one of my favorite presidents, now this is the unfavorite part of his presidency, and there's a lot of information that has to go behind this, but here's this, in essence, what he did. He took away the gold standard. He said you had to turn in your gold. Now, it was worth $20.60 an ounce. So if you had $1,000 of gold, you were paid $20.60 an ounce, and it was gold backed at the time. So you got that transfer money. The Bank of France had $1.5 million of gold in their bank. And they were told, we're going to take that gold. No, you're not. And they argued back and forth, and they just finally did it. And they gave them $20.60 of cash for their gold. So they took their gold from them. And that's where we get the Fort Knox idea. Isn't that interesting? Now, how come in 1934, gold is worth 33 bucks an ounce? Wait, now they've defrauded and they've taken the money away from that. I mean, that's a huge amount of value. So they have this gold, and they've increased the value of it because a few people have it. It increases the value, and we're sitting over here stuck. The Federal Reserve, guys, the Federal Reserve, our money in 1913 is worth 5% of what it used to be. We wonder why prices are costing this much. This is called the fiat money. It's only based upon what the Federal Reserve says it's worth. Go look at your dollar bill. Go look at your $5 bill. It says Federal Reserve, and it's backed by what they tell you it's worth. What? And it goes up and down in values. And we'll value it based upon, the mark and everything else. So this is the gross part of it. It's a debt kind of point, but it's a corruption of that. So the IRS is part of that corruption. They're the illegal behavior. So this is in your second slide here. The illegal behavior from the officials and departure from the texts of the Constitution that we're not supposed to be. There's no taxation without representation. This is a perfect example. And this is where NESARA comes from, okay? It's from the 14th Amendment in Section 4, this illegal level of taxation. And it doesn't just tax on the cash itself, it's on what's written in the contract. Now, I remember one time, long story, but basically I was in court over an issue of a contract. Now, if two people get into a contract and they have the ability to understand, they have mental capacity, that's fine, to be able to understand, as long as it's two people and the contract is reasonable. I mean, the judge has to do that. And it's reasonable, it's binding, okay? If I give you $5,000 to give me 5,000 shares, right? And it's a reasonable contract that makes sense, then that is binding. I don't care if the other person wants to change their mind on the back end. And so I didn't give you a refund privilege. It is what it is, right? That's how we look at that. But see, the American people have not heard this part of it, which makes the debts null and void. So we have paid compound interest in the devaluing of our process. I mean, we have to pay so much interest on a 30-year mortgage. And there's this massive amount of interest that is just almost never paid unless you go all the way through your 30 years. Can I just tell you a little bit about what the Bible says about this? James 5:3, your silver and your gold are corroded. Their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like the fire. You have stored up the treasures for the last day. Witness means martyrion. The evidence against a person would lead to his ruin or his death. No, we're not talking about martyrion. This is where we get the idea of martyr. A martyr is a person that would die based upon the evidence for or against that person, okay? And in essence here, in what James is saying, is that the silver and gold are the evidences against those who hoard it, stored it up for the treasure of the last days. And that treasure in the last days is coming. I believe that there's a great transfer of wealth that's occurring before the last part of the last days. And we're going to talk about that. But there's always a fiat currency that goes to a gold-backed system, and it flows back over to a fiat. And we're seeing that changeover, that through Donald Trump, that we see that changeover into a gold-backed currency. James 5 and 6. You have lived luxuriously on the land and have indulged yourselves for the day of the slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous man. He doesn't resist you. Guys, the IRS have withheld the land. We could talk about the land grabbings that have occurred in the 2008-2009 grossness of Bush and of Obama. Both of them were complicit in the role of the land grabs. I mean, people, signed these 5-year ARMs, and then suddenly when the 5-year ARM comes up, now they have to pay interest and principal, and they can't afford it. And so they lost their land, even though they had some value in it, and it was foreclosed on. The banks took it and resold it again. Wow. And we gave them money. We had bailout money of billions and billions of dollars, and they just put it in their own pocket. The bankers have been killing people and stealing from people, and their judgment is coming. In Titus 5:18, for the scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, and the worker is worthy of his wages. Okay, this is a deep one. The muzzling is an implementation of reducing the worker. So it's like putting on extra weights while I'm trying to move forward, okay? So you're pulling back the ability, that would be the implementation, that's the ox, that would be like the tractor. And by the way, NESARA was built from the farmers who were defrauded in the 80s. Guys, Scripture is talking about NESARA inside of it, and it uses this fascinating reference of farming. He could have talked about ranching, he could have talked about other businesses, but this is the gross people who don't allow the wages of the person, muzzle the person. Muzzle, by the way, is to put this thing on the mask. That is a type of mask, and guess what? We're in the middle of a mask epidemic issues. The wages are taking the wages, which is seen as an evil. We're not saying, and that is a type of the IRS. The IRS takes part of your wages, pulls you back because you can't make as much money, puts it through the Federal Reserve, which devalues your money, and it goes right back in a circular thing. And by the way, that's called money laundering. Psalms 37:21, a wicked man borrows and does not repay. The righteous one is gracious in his giving. Okay, who's the righteous one? That's the person that is just doing the job. That's what we, as the bride, is trying to do. But what's the wicked? You see, they've never paid back all of the interest that's happening to us, that's taken from us. We've lost that ability, so they keep taking it from the wages. They pull back the ability, they mess up, and then they throw jobs across the world, and then they pay pennies on the dollar. Nike takes away the workers in America and puts it in China. They're getting pennies on the dollar just to do their work, and they're held back. It's that same thing. They need to, even if Nike stays out there, they should be paying the worker his wages. So NESARA is the National Economic Stabilization and Recovery Act. Now, how do we know some of the evidences of this? Now, the Federal Reserve's been stuck over here out in the middle of nowhere. But when the PPP thing came, the Payroll Protection Act basically comes in, the PPP loan, when the CARES Act came in, there was going to be monies that were coming to small businesses like my own, okay? And I was looking at this, and there was a forgiveness part that I didn't believe. I didn't understand this. And I remember in March when, this NESARA stuff was sort of coming out. I was researching about this issue. And what was happening is the PPP loan, what Donald Trump did is took the Federal Reserve and shoved them right underneath the Treasury. Now, that's where they're supposed to be in the first place, but they've moved themselves out of position. It goes the IRS from the people, the IRS to the Treasury, out to the Federal Reserve. I'll explain that just a little bit more. But what he did is he shoved them underneath the Treasury Department. And the PPP loan is never supposed to be paid back. Now, there are a few caveats in there, but any business owner worth their weight in salt is going to do some of the basic points that are inside the PPP loan. But we won't have to pay it back. That is money that is huge for that business to keep going. And he did that for us. So we followed the fiat to its end. Okay, so the Federal Reserve right now, this is August of 2020, is $26.6 trillion. That's $213,000 per taxpayer. I can't come up with $213 trillion, $1,000. I remember when the BLM said you need to have $44 trillion for reparations. Like, I basically put this on Twitter. It's like, let me look in my back pocket. Come on. You're talking about millions upon millions upon millions of dollars for me to come up with probably about 1.5 million per taxpayer to pay reparations. I mean, first off, this is stupid. It's never going to happen. And when people would sign it into law, and it's just fake. There's $80 trillion of debt in America. And that debt isn't just that just the debt to the Federal Reserve, which is just unrighteous. We've already kind of explained. It's the central bankers just stealing and stealing and stealing and stealing. We spend $560 to maybe $600 billion a year just to go to the interest payments of the Federal Reserve. How unrighteous is that? We never even make the basic payments. The GDP, this is the gross domestic product. When you look at the debt to income ratio, okay, the debt of the 26 trillion to the GDP of America, what we can bring in based upon property taxes and sales tax and all these other little tax points. Every little tax point, including more specifically the income tax. We're 149%. We're like swimming underneath. We can't possibly do this. Do you know if you wanted to do, whether it's Chapter 7, Chapter 11, Chapter 13 bankruptcy, depending upon your entity, whether you're an S corporation, or just a private entity, just a person, and you want to get into foreclosure, which probably leads you, bankruptcy, which leads you into foreclosure and a whole bunch of different things. If you're at 50% of your debt to income ratio, you're completely eligible from judgmental standards, and that's going to be in local court, to declare bankruptcy. Wait, there's no way we can pay this $149 billion off, or 149% off. Here's the cool part. Now, you're going to see this on the slide here, and just ignore it because I can't keep up with the number. When I wrote this, it was a lot lower. The gold money standard, the USA has at least 286 million ounces of gold. I have 1775. It's like over $2,000 a share, essentially. The point, and then it goes up and down, so don't get into that point. The point is there's a huge amount of money. I could give you some other numbers, like the World Settlement Corporation has $47 trillion from these ancient funds. And there's another couple, there's two other ones. There's one was $83 trillion, that $47 trillion came in the LA County, and Obama blocked it in The Hague back in 2011. The same kind of time frame, we had blockage of a $10 trillion amount and an $83 trillion amount that's not come into America. These are tried to come in. And the anti-Kabbalists are coming in and trying to build in a placement to take away the debts that are unrighteous. These are unrighteous kinds of things that are happening. And that's the shift over. You see, when Greece went through their bankruptcy, the EU had to spend money to get them out of that bankruptcy. That's why most people, when they think about defunding the Fed, it just basically destroys the economy. Here's what Donald Trump has done from February actually, all the way through. He has shoved the Federal Reserve underneath the Treasury Department and required them to take on the grossest debts. Now here's what you have to catch, how cool this is. When a person wants to declare bankruptcy and they have, let's say, 700 credit, that's enough to be able to get good credit cards. They'll go out and get extra credit cards. They will boost their amounts and they will spend as much money upon that. Now they can't do, things that could be taken away, like cars and houses could potentially be taken away. But they have to have other, so they'll buy things and they'll buy TVs and other things. And they'll come into different places and spend the money. And then that money, when they declare bankruptcy and their credit goes down to 350, let's say, they can't get any credit, but they've gotten enough, assets to be able to work with, right? So they might be able to sell that on eBay or whatever that thing is. And that's how they have the assets. That's what a lot of people have done over the years with that. That same kind of thing, guys, is happening in the NESARA. Donald Trump is taking the Kabbalists and going, you know what, I'm going to fund every little thing I can come up with. All the cruddy debts I'm going to throw on there. And you want to have two, this is really powerful, two reasons why we know it's happening. Fiat money coming from the Federal Reserve has to be used. So we have, whether we have the paper bills or we have the change, has to come through that. Now, the paper ones go in and out of circulation very quickly, because you rip them up, okay? But coins haven't been made for a while. Do you know that most of your places around America are struggling with coins? I was in a Walgreens, I think it was, and they were asking, can you please use a credit card? And they'll tell you over and over, because they don't have any change. It's because change is not coming out anymore, because it has to be remade into this new rainbow currency. That is $100 trillion of backed up currency in it, based upon a gold standard. This stuff is coming. And one of the cooler things that happened to me is that I refinanced my loan in my house. And as I refinanced the house, it never happened to me before. But by the way, bankers will tell you it does happen. But this never happened to me. I have bought many houses and refied more houses than I can count over the time frames, right? I get this letter. Refi the house. I know it's going to get sold. It's sold to this one place, okay? I won't say the name, but they sold it to this place. It's kind of a small little agency. They sold the loan to Fannie Mae. Now, you go, what is Fannie Mae? Fannie Mae was taken under the Federal Reserve when it went through its own level of bankruptcy for its cruddy loans that they did. So that Fannie Mae, all these gross house loans that were unpayable debts, went into the Federal Reserve on their balance sheet. And it basically was wiped off. And here's what this letter said. I had to have like 3 people read it, because I'm looking at it going, what? Here's what it says. The Fannie Mae has bought your loan under the Federal Reserve. Okay. Don't write us a check. Still write it to your mortgage place. Okay. And it gives a few other little caveats in there. My loan's already in the Federal Reserve. There's a defunding that's coming, and it's going to be a really cool thing, but you're going to need information about this. You need to know what the Federal Reserve is and stop fighting against what Donald Trump is trying to accomplish for you. It's a powerful thing that's coming out there. So thank you for listening. I know it's a lot of information. We're going to go over a lot more fun things as we go along. Thank you so much.